Have you ever wondered why official history textbooks describe the 19th century as an era of unprecedented technological progress and romanticism, yet shamefully omit that it was a century of total, incessant global slaughter? We are told that these were disparate conflicts. We are told that Britain fought for colonies, the United States of America dealt with internal contradictions, and China suffered from the Opium Wars. But what if I told you that all of this is a blatant lie? What if no such disunity existed? Look at a map of conflicts from 1830 to 1870. These are not local skirmishes. This was a single, synchronized, global military operation. This was the First World War, which historians deliberately fragmented into dozens of minor names to conceal the main enemy. Who were the united armies of the New World Order truly fighting against? Who was being purged with bayonets and grape shot from America to China, from Crimea to Paraguay? The answer to this question will overturn your perception of reality. We are talking about the asymmetrical wars of the 19th century. Wars where one side possessed resources, logistics, and perhaps technologies incomprehensible to the average person of that era, while the other side, that was us, or those who lived here before us. Let's start with the dry language of facts, which academic historians so dislike. Open any list of wars from the mid-19th century. Just look at the dates. 1848, the spring of nations in Europe. Revolutions erupt everywhere simultaneously, as if on cue from an invisible conductor. 1853, the Crimean War. 1857, the Sepoy Mutiny in India. 1861, the Civil War in the United States of America. 1864, the Paraguayan War. 1850, the beginning of the Taiping Rebellion in China. Doesn't it seem strange to you that the entire world ignited in a single decade? Official science will give you 100 different reasons: economy, religion, the struggle for independence. But let's apply logic. When a fire starts simultaneously in the living room, the attic, and the basement, you don't think these are random ignitions from faulty wiring, do you? You understand that the house is being set on fire. In the 19th century, our common home was deliberately set on fire. And the most terrible, the bloodiest page of this cleansing was the so-called Taiping Rebellion in China. Historians dryly record the numbers: 20, 30, and according to some sources, up to 100 million dead. Ponder these words: 100 million people. That is more than the population of many modern countries. We are told that this was a civil war caused by a religious fanatic. Seriously? Peasants with hoes killed 100 million people? Such a scale of genocide requires an industrial machine of destruction. It requires artillery, logistics, resources that the rebels simply could not have possessed. If we look at photographs and engravings of ruined Chinese cities from that time, we will see not traces of fires, but ruins reminiscent of the aftermath of 20th century carpet bombings. Stone buildings were pulverized. Who possessed such power in the mid-19th century? And most importantly, who was being destroyed there? There is a theory that China at that time was not at all a backward agrarian country, but one of the last strongholds of an old civilization, that very Tartary, or Great Asia, which preserved remnants of ancient technologies and knowledge. The Taiping Rebellion was a cover operation. Under the guise of suppressing a revolt, Western powers, together with the Manchu dynasty, annihilated the indigenous population that remembered true history and possessed skills dangerous to the new masters of the world. Now let's move to the other side of the world. The United States of America. The Civil War between the North and the South. We were instilled from childhood that this was a war for the liberation of slaves, the noble North against the slave-owning South. But let's look at photographs of the ruined cities of the South. Richmond, Atlanta, Charleston. Look at these images carefully. You see brick shells without roofs, scorched neighborhoods, protruding skeletons of buildings. This does not resemble the result of field artillery actions of those years. Cannonballs of that era left holes in walls. They did not raze entire neighborhoods to their foundations. The nature of the destruction surprisingly resembles Dresden or Hiroshima. What if the Civil War in America was not civil at all? What if the Northern Army was performing the function of cleansing a territory where city-states, part of the Old World's global system, were located? The South was agrarian and wealthy. Its architecture was ancient, majestic, impossible to have been built by colonists arriving in wagons. These cities had to be destroyed to erase the memory of who truly built them. And the population? The population was simply replaced. Pay attention to the strange statistics of casualties. Official figures grow with each year of recalculation. Initially, they spoke of 300,000. Now they speak of 1 million. But if you look at the demographic gaps, a much larger number of people are missing. Where did they go? Let's move on. The Crimean War. We are told that Russia clashed with a coalition of Britain, France, and Turkey. But why would the world's greatest powers send their enormous fleets into the closed Black Sea to besiege a single city, Sevastopol, for years? The official version about control over the straits does not withstand criticism. Such a concentration of forces and resources for one point on the map is absurd from a military perspective, unless the goal was entirely different. Look at the bastions of Sevastopol before its destruction. These are cyclopean structures, carved into the rock, with underground communications that could not be built with a pickaxe and shovel under enemy fire. Sevastopol, like many other star fortresses around the world, was an object of ancient infrastructure. An energy hub? A logistical center? We don't know exactly. But we do know that the coalition relentlessly wiped it off the face of the earth with maniacal persistence. They bombed it not to capture it, but to destroy it, to level it to the ground, to turn antiquity into rubble. And pay attention to the soldiers' uniforms. French, British, Sardinians, they all look identical, as if dressed from the same warehouse, a standardized invasion army. And against whom? Against similar soldiers in similar uniforms. This looks like a fixed match, where two armies destroy an ancient city, and at the same time dispose of the surplus population of their own countries in senseless, bloody assaults. Now, look at the most tragic and mysterious conflict, the Paraguayan War. 1864, tiny Paraguay against giants, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. The outcome of this war is monstrous. Up to 90% of Paraguay's male population perished. 90%. This is not a war. This is genocide. This is a total cleansing of the territory to zero. Why? What was Paraguay hiding? Historians say that Paraguay was an incredibly developed, self-sufficient country, with railroads and telegraphs built without British loans. It was a country system that fell outside the control of London's financial clans. But there is another version. Paraguay was a refuge. There, deep within the continent, enclaves of that very previous civilization were preserved, attempting to survive after a global catastrophe. A coalition of neighbors, armed and financed from outside, simply came and physically eliminated all carriers of the old genotype. Women and children were left to mix blood and create a new, obedient people. But the men, who remembered freedom and technology, were cut down at the root. All of this leads us to a chilling thought. The 19th century was a time when some third force was operating on Earth, a force that coordinated strikes, supplied weapons, and rewrote history in real time. We see traces of weapons used that surpass in power everything that officially existed at that time. We see melted forts in America and Europe. We see cities buried under several feet of clay, and on top of this clay, soldiers in bright uniforms march, finishing off those who survived the cataclysm. The asymmetry of these wars was not in tactics. It was in the fact that the civilized world was fighting against ruins, against fragments of a great past. They were cleansing the territory for us. For a new civilization that should remember nothing that existed before the mid-19th century. And to hide the traces of this crime, they invented the terms industrialization, colonial wars, and civil conflicts. But you cannot deceive mathematics. The demographic collapses of that time scream that the Earth's population decreased not by percentages, but by orders of magnitude. And now we will try to understand exactly how this happened and what technical means were used for it. Let's set aside emotions and turn to dry, ruthless logistics. Any military expert will tell you that war is primarily about supply. For an army of 100,000 people to operate effectively in foreign territory, it needs tons of food, fodder for horses, gunpowder, lead, and medicine daily. Official history claims that in the mid-19th century, all of this was delivered on creaking carts over muddy dirt roads or by sailing ships dependent on the wind. But if we overlay maps of military operations onto maps of the actual terrain passability of that time, we run into an insoluble contradiction. The scale of operations in China, India, and America is technically impossible with the level of transport development that we are told about in school. Take, for example, the so-called colonial conquests. We are told that the British, French, and Dutch sailed to wild shores, planted a flag, and within a couple of years erected magnificent cities there, with parliaments, train stations, universities, and banks. Look at the architecture of Bombay, Melbourne, Cape Town, or Hanoi in the mid-19th century. These are granite and marble colossi with columns, intricate stucco work, and perfectly calculated acoustics. Historians assure us that all of this was built by convicts, soldiers, and uneducated local laborers using primitive winches and hand saws. Do you believe that, amidst constant revolts, epidemics, and a lack of industrial base, masterpieces of ancient caliber could be built from scratch? Or is it more logical to assume that these cities had already stood there for hundreds, perhaps even thousands of years? And the colonizers simply occupied the empty buildings, put up their signs, and called it founding a city? The asymmetrical wars of the 19th century were wars for real estate, a global corporate takeover. That's why the destruction was so selective. Only those objects that bore clear symbols of the old faith or old power, or those whose purpose the new masters could not understand or use, were destroyed. Recall the burning of the Summer Palace in Beijing in 1860. Anglo-French forces didn't just loot it. They methodically burned and blew up this complex over several days. Why spend so much explosives on a palace complex? Because the Summer Palace was not just an emperor's residence. It was a library, an archive, a repository of technologies and artifacts of Great Asia. It wasn't the palace that was destroyed. It was a database. We are told that the savage Europeans simply wanted to punish the Chinese. No, This was a hard drive wipe before installing a new operating system. Another shocking aspect is the photographs from those years. The mid-19th century marked the birth of photography. And what do we see in the first pictures from the Crimean War or the American Civil War? We see strange, empty cities. St. Petersburg, Moscow, Paris, Washington. Not a soul on the streets. Rare, solitary figures who look like ghosts. Historians explain this by long exposure times, saying people moved and blurred. But why are the trees sharp then? Why aren't the shadows blurred? Why do we see clearly standing soldiers in some photos, but the city around them is deserted? It creates an eerie impression that troops are entering already empty, cleansed cities. Cities from which the population had disappeared even before the army arrived. Perhaps the wars were not fought against armies, but against the remnants of survivors after some cataclysm that had devastated these metropolises. The armies of the 19th century were marauders who came to the ruins of a great civilization to finish off the survivors and appropriate what remained. Note the so-called architecture of ruins, popular in paintings of that era. Artists painted ancient ruins not because it was fashionable, they painted from life. The entire world in the mid-19th century was littered with ruins. And these ruins were not ancient in the usual sense. They were fresh destructions. Military actions were carried out to completely level what could not be restored, and to bury the first floors of what was decided to keep with soil. This is where the cultural layer of several feet came from, covering the first floor windows around the world. This did not grow in 100 years. These are the consequences of an engineering operation to conceal the true ground level. Wars and the burying of cities proceeded in parallel. While some regiments finished off resistance in the mountains of the Caucasus or the American prairies, other engineering battalions filled the streets of European capitals with clay and earth, creating a new landscape. But who was the enemy? Who exactly was being cleansed? Look at the maps of Tartary, which were still printed in encyclopedias until the mid-19th century, and then suddenly disappeared. This is a gigantic territory, from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, from the Arctic Ocean to India. This is not a desert. Hundreds of cities are marked there. Where are they now? Official history says that nomads lived there in yurts. But archaeology, the kind not shown to the general public, finds the foundations of enormous stone structures in the Siberian taiga, in the steppes of Kazakhstan, in the deserts of Turkmenistan. The asymmetrical wars were waged against a confederation of free city-states that did not submit to a single center in London or the Vatican. Their technological way of life was different. Perhaps they did not possess firearms in our understanding, using other principles of defense: sonic, vibrational, energetic, which ceased to work after a change in the planet's physical conditions, that very cataclysm. And then they came to finish them off with primitive but effective gunpowder and lead. And here we come to the most terrifying question. Where did so many soldiers for these wars come from? If the population was partially destroyed by a cataclysm, where did the million-strong armies of the North, in the United States, or the colonial core of Britain come from? There is a frightening theory about cloning, or artificial human cultivation. Remember the strange orphanages and incubators that opened en masse around the world precisely in the mid-19th century? A huge number of orphans, whose origins are obscure. These children were drilled, deprived of history, given new surnames, and sent to the army or factories. They were ideal cannon fodder, people without a past, without ancestral memory, absolutely obedient to the system. A new army for a new world. Their task was to kill the old humanity, and judging by the demographic gaps and the change in the ethnic composition of many regions, they accomplished this task brilliantly. Now, prepare for your skepticism to undergo its most severe test. We have reached a point of no return in our investigation. If previous facts could still be attributed to coincidences or chroniclers' errors, we will now touch upon things that are physically impossible to explain within the official paradigm. Let's talk about technologies of destruction. Look at the forts and fortresses that were supposedly bombed in the mid-19th century. Fort Sumter, Fort Pulaski, fortifications near Paris or Kronstadt. We are told they were fired upon with cast-iron cannonballs filled with black powder. But what do we actually see? We see melted brick. We see granite that flowed like wax. The melting point of granite is about 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit, about 1,200 degrees Celsius. Brick melts at even higher temperatures. A black powder explosion does not generate such temperatures even at the epicenter, let alone enough to melt multi-foot walls into a vitreous mass. This phenomenon is called vitrification, and it is found everywhere in the ruins of that era. This means only one thing. In the so-called wars of the 19th century, weapons of a completely different class were used. Perhaps plasma weapons, perhaps high-power thermal weapons, the operating principle of which is unknown to us today or is classified. The asymmetry of this war lay in the fact that one side, the conditional cleaners, had access to orbital or atmospheric strike technologies, while the defenders, the inhabitants of the old cities, were deprived of this protection, perhaps due to a preceding global system failure. Imagine the situation. You live in a high-tech city, but your dome is offline, power is gone, and then they arrive. Those who call themselves the new power. They don't storm the walls. They simply burn out neighborhoods with directed pulses, turning stone into lava and people into dust. And then, 50 years later, historians would write that it was a fire in an ammunition depot or a lucky mortar shot. Look at the great fires of the 19th century. Chicago, Boston, Spokane, Seattle, Moscow, Kiev. Dozens of major cities burned to the ground following the same scenario. The official version is always laughable. A cow kicked over a lamp, a spark landed in hay, and from this spark, acres of stone and brick buildings burned down. Fire spreads so fast that people don't have time to escape their homes. Steel melts and flows into storm drains, and stone crumbles into sand. These were not fires. These were carpet bombings, or the use of directed energy weapons. This was a deliberate operation to destroy the architectural heritage of the previous civilization. Cities didn't just burn, they were cleared to zero, so that primitive red brick boxes, which we now consider historic buildings, could be built in their place. Note, after these fires, city layouts often changed dramatically. The star-shaped street structures were destroyed, replaced by a dull, easily controllable grid. But the most terrifying thing lies not in the destroyed homes, but in the substitution of the very essence of human existence. The asymmetrical wars of the 19th century were wars against memory. It was during this period that not only residential areas, but also gigantic libraries, archives, and museums burned down all over the world. The fire at the Library of Congress in 1851, which destroyed 2/3 of its books, fires in European archives, the destruction of chronicles in China. What were they burning? They were burning technical documentation, maps of the real world, lists of real dynasties, knowledge of free energy, ether, and atmospheric electricity. We were thrown back thousands of years in development, artificially plunged into the age of coal and steam. We were given primitive hydrocarbon burning technologies instead of the clean energy our ancestors used. And so that we wouldn't ask questions, looking at majestic cathedrals and star fortresses, we were told they were just temples and fortifications. Although any engineer, looking at the plan of a star fortress, would tell you that for defense against infantry and artillery, such complex geometry is not only unnecessary, but harmful. These are schematics. These are gigantic circuit boards lying on the ground. And they were destroyed, first and foremost, to de-energize the planet. Another shocking fact is the explosive population growth immediately after these bloody massacres. Mathematics fails again here. How can a country's population double in 20 to 30 years after a third of its men died in war and diseases and famine wiped out just as many more? This is biologically impossible. A woman cannot give birth to 5 children a year. The only explanation is a massive influx of population from outside, or, even more chillingly, the artificial production of people. We have already discussed orphans, but the scale of the problem is broader. Entire ethnic groups appear that were not on maps before. Languages are rewritten. In the mid-19th century, literary languages were created in Europe and Asia. Dialects were unified, and new grammatical norms were introduced. People were reprogrammed, like computers. The old language, which the whole world spoke before the catastrophe, was fragmented into dozens of artificial dialects to divide us, to make us strangers to one another. The principle of divide and conquer was implemented precisely then, during the era of the Great Cleansing. We are the descendants of those who survived this apocalypse, but at the cost of a complete loss of memory. Or are we the descendants of those who were settled into empty cities? Look at old cemeteries. Why do gravestones before the mid-19th century often lack crosses and instead are adorned with strange urns, buckets, inverted torches, or solar symbols? Why were they so massively destroyed and replaced with standard slabs? Because the dead cannot lie. Old cemeteries could have told us who truly lived here, how long they lived, and they lived, perhaps, much longer than us, and what they believed in. The cleansing of cemeteries proceeded in parallel with the wars. It was a war not only against the living, but also against the dead. The new masters of the world needed a clean history, starting with dark ages and leading to shining progress under their careful guidance. Consider this. All the great inventions, radio, electricity, telephone, automobiles, appeared in an avalanche at the end of the 19th century, as if someone opened a floodgate. We are told that this was the genius of lone inventors, but most of these inventions appeared immediately in a finished state, without a long evolution of prototypes. Doesn't it seem to you that these are simply the permitted remnants of knowledge from the civilization that had just been destroyed? The victors appropriated the technologies of the defeated, simplified them, monetized them, and presented them as their own achievements. Tesla, Edison, Bell. Perhaps they were not inventors, but merely talented archaeologists who managed to decipher some of the surviving technical documentation. And what they couldn't understand, or what was too dangerous for the powers that be, was hidden or destroyed again. The asymmetrical wars were the final act of a global catastrophe. First, the world was engulfed by something terrible. A flood, a celestial impact, a pole shift, which caused those very mud flows that buried cities. And then, while the survivors tried to dig out their homes and rebuild their lives, the armies of the New World Order arrived. They finished off the weakened. They blew up the surviving power station fortresses. They burned books, and they rewrote calendars. Perhaps even the chronology itself was shifted or altered, so that we could never reconcile dates and understand that great antiquity ended not thousands of years ago, but literally yesterday, behind the backs of our great-great-grandparents. We live on the graveyard of a great civilization, and we have been indoctrinated into believing that we are the pinnacle of creation. But the truth breaks through the asphalt. Look at the so-called World's Fairs of the late 19th century. Paris, Chicago, St. Louis, Philadelphia. We are told that these incredible complexes of ancient palaces, canals, towers, and fountains were built from plaster and tow for just 1 year to entertain the public, and then torn down. Do you believe this? Have you seen photographs of their construction? There are practically none, but there are photographs of completed, majestic cities that surpass everything we build today in terms of complexity. Colonnades, sculptures, complex engineering infrastructure. And all of this supposedly temporary scenery? No. World's fairs were grandiose operations to legalize appropriation. The new masters of the world found surviving, preserved city complexes of the old civilization, slightly restored them, held achievement exhibitions there, showing the savage visitors the remnants of past grandeur as their own inventions, and then destroyed them. They blew them up, burned them down, dismantled them for building materials. They destroyed the evidence. They showed people a paradise they could live in, and immediately wiped it off the face of the earth, accustoming them to the idea that beauty is fleeting, and one should live in gray concrete boxes. And what else was shown at these exhibitions besides plaster palaces? Human zoos. This is one of the most shameful pages of official history, which people prefer not to remember. People, representatives of wild tribes, supposedly brought from colonies, were kept in cages and enclosures. But look at the faces of these savages in old photos. Many of them have noble European facial features. They're just dressed in furs or rags. What if they weren't savages? What if they were captured survivors of the old elite, stripped of everything, and put on display for ridicule? The new power told the crowd, "Look, this is your past. It's savagery, and we are your future. Progress and civilization." We were made to believe that we descended from apes, when in reality we were lowered to a level close to animals, stripped of our divine heritage. And to solidify this success, the Prussian education system was introduced. It was precisely in the mid-19th century that barrack-style schools were introduced worldwide, as if on command. Children were separated from their families, herded into classrooms, forced to sit still for hours, and made to memorize approved dogmas. Why? To kill creativity, to erase ancestral memory, to raise ideal executors, factory workers, and soldiers who wouldn't ask questions. Bell for the teacher. Raise your hand. Strict discipline. These aren't about knowledge. They're about training. We were taught not to think, but to memorize. We were taught to believe authorities, not our own eyes. Our physics was replaced, removing the concept of ether, an infinite source of energy that our ancestors used. We were hooked on hydrocarbons, oil, gas, coal, resources that can be controlled. This entire system of lies rests on our ignorance, on the fact that we are afraid to look into the abyss of truth. We are afraid to admit that official history is the script of a bad play, that the kings and presidents of the 19th century are actors appointed by an occupying administration, that revolutions are special operations for property redistribution, that we are orphans forced to love our jailers. Why was all this necessary? For what purpose was this planetary genocide orchestrated?